And it's something that I always valued without actually realising it or analysing it. Unconventionally sometimes, because education is obviously incredibly important. When I was little and in primary school, very young, I used to look out the window and feel trapped. When I was little, I used to run across the fields with my dog and run with the animals, and to me, it was almost like a trap. I used to think, well, how can a child have all this energy and want to run and jump and do something and have to sit at a desk for 8 hours a day? I know that's unconventional, but that was how I felt. Nevertheless, I did quite well in my exams. I don't know how. Even towards animals, whenever I saw trapped animals, I would be desperate to rescue them. I hated to see anything trapped, always. And because freedom is just so important, and we don't value it enough until we lose it. When Gary was little, he was very different, but because our background was music, and we knew a lot of people who were musicians and artists, he was eccentric, but more than they were. But I mean, we have friends who talk about the past life as though it happened last week. So Gary was just a little bit more eccentric than they were. When he was 16, he actually had a complete meltdown. His mental faculties went. He was really in a bad way. He could hardly talk or communicate at all. We thought then he had a brain tumour, and we took him to a psychiatrist, sorry, not a psychiatrist, we took him to a surgeon, a doctor, to find out if he did have a brain tumour, and he didn't. So we couldn't understand what's happening. He would collapse in the tube station. He was having complete breakdowns all the time. And what it was the first time that Gary had ever left his local domain. He had never been away from his home, and he had a job in London. And it was so traumatic for him to actually travel into London that that's when it kicked in. Because up until then, he had felt safe in his own environment. We didn't know anything about Asperger's syndrome then, because the World Health Organization didn't know about it until the mid-1990s, by which time Gary was 30 years old. As time went on, Gary, he got a computer when he was about 9 years old. He was very good on it, which we were pleased, because it gave him a little bit of self-esteem. He never wanted to go out, he always wanted to stay at home. He said, "Don't make me go out to play, Mum, just let me stay in." He loved to be in his room, he loved to do his music, and he played Moonlight Sonata one day, totally out of the blue. He's not a savant, he just is talented, but hides it. He does things for himself, as opposed to wanting other people to know about it. So Gary, we thought he was doing quite well, and there's a girl that he was with since his childhood, since school, who knew Gary and was very, very understanding with him. That was Tamsin, and Tamsin was an incredible support to Gary. And then we actually said, my husband and I, isn't it amazing? Gary's reached this age, which was 35. He's never got into trouble with the police. He's never got into heavy drugs, and he's like a really nice guy. No sooner had we said this than suddenly Gary phoned. He says, "Mum, I've got something to tell you." And he told us that he had been arrested. We said, "Well, why would you be arrested?" He said, "For hacking into the Pentagon and NASA." We thought, well, how on earth could he hack into the Pentagon and NASA? But the worst thing that he did, and which was really his downfall, is he left a note saying, "Your security is crap." And that was like the worst thing possible, because they didn't like to be embarrassed. But we thought, well, it'll be okay. The police, the high-tech crime unit, were really nice. They said, "We need people like you. We'd like someone like you to work for us. You'll probably get 6 months community service." So Gary says, "Don't worry, it's fine. I'll get 6 months community service." But I knew instinctively it wasn't going to be that easy. This was America, it was the Pentagon and NASA, and I just knew we were in trouble. But I hoped it would go away. Now, we carried on. The police said, "You're on bail until such time we want to talk to you again." Then they removed the bail, and then suddenly they said, "America is thinking of extraditing you." And I just could not believe it, the fear that went through me, this gentle guy, I mean he's gentle to the core, to be extradited for computer hacking. Not until then, when people got extradited, it was for murder and really heinous crimes, not for doing something stupid in a computer, which obviously you shouldn't have done, but nevertheless, it was a stupid thing to do. But we thought, it's not going to happen, it can't. And then we went to court, and Gary had a really good QC called Edmund Lawson. And the other barrister there started to bring in a conversation from the US Embassy. And suddenly Edmund jumped in because he said, yes, he says, and what about the rest of that conversation? He says, one state wants to see Gary Fry. Now we could not believe this. And the guy said, well, you can't bring that in. He said, because that conversation was privileged. He says, you've opened it up, I can bring it in. And we thought, well, that's it. It was so horrendous and upsetting to hear that somebody wanted somebody to fry. But we thought, that won't stop him going, because we don't extradite people to places that have torture or things like that. So we thought that'd be the end of it. So the judge, he sympathised, and he thought it was an anathema, and it's really wrong. But then he said, extradite him. And the sentence proposed went from 6 months in the UK to 60 years in the US, 10 years per count. And the fear that goes through you when you hear about that. Gary was terrified. He thought he's going to go to this awful prison, be dragged in chains, and be raped and abused, because 60% of the rapes are actually in prison in America, of the rapes in America. So he was absolutely terrified. And he thought, sorry, I'm jumping from thing to thing. After that, Gary he lost the case, he lost another. We appealed, we had a judicial review, and we kept going back and back again. And his solicitor, Karen, said, don't worry, we've been at the end before, we'll carry on fighting. And we did. And then we lost in the House of Lords. Now, we had huge hope for the House of Lords, absolutely huge. And they ruled against us. And as far as I'm concerned, right or wrong, they had made up their minds beforehand, but they wanted to justify what their decision was, because that's certainly the way it sounded with everything they said. So after that, Guy was completely devastated. He was suicidal. And he actually, it's not in an emotional way, because someone with Asperger's, it's pure logic. And logically, to him, he would rather die, take his own life in his own country, than to be taken thousands of miles. He never left home, he never left North London. I mean, he's a person who never travelled. And the thought of being taken there, incarcerated, locked up, it was so frightening to him that for him, death was preferred. So there are people who will prefer death to losing freedom, because for them, it is so terrifying to think of. Our lives changed so much. We ended up working 24 hours a day, not being able to earn a living, eventually had to sell our house because all we had to do was work and saving Gary, so we couldn't earn a living. But nevertheless, this was the most important thing. And that's when basically people power came. And God, I'm proud of people. I've met so many good people. A guy we'd never met travelled 200 miles to help me. He didn't know us, he hadn't seen us, he had Tourette's, and he travelled 200 miles. We then had a girl from London who saw me on TV, and she saw how upset I was, and she thought, she needs help. Claire Simmons, her name is, and she was amazing. She was my right-hand person. And when I wrote letters, the way she wrote letters was almost indistinguishable from mine, which was really useful. So we fought and fought. I emailed every single MP in every single party, and I was convinced that the Home Secretary would stand up and say no. Not one did. And I was really disappointed in that, because I had voted for Labour my entire life. And I thought they won't let this happen. Well, 5 of them did. And not only that, the last one wanted him to go. Even after extradition was refused, he says he should have gone. Now that was a big surprise, and it really shocked me. And I found that there are good people in all parties, and there are bad people. Well, not necessarily bad, but not very good people in all parties. And that's the reality. Gary's MP, David Burrows, Conservative, was the most amazing man. He fought and fought for Gary. He stood up and he gave speech after speech. He never stopped. He threatened to resign. He just would not stop, and he was wonderful. Dominic Grieve gave a great speech in the Conservative Party conference, standing up for Gary and saying, why should I have to go? There were so many people. Tony Benn was amazing. I just love Tony Benn. He stood up for Gary, as did Michael Meacher, Nick Clegg, Lord Carlisle, all parties. But people came, and there was people on Twitter. I'd never been on social media, I wasn't interested, but my husband said, no, you've got to go on here because it will help. So I went on to Twitter, and there was people who contacted me who just became like this force, and we'd have demos and they'd all be there, and it was like this force of good. Then the newspapers come on, and it was the Daily Mail, it was the Guardian, it was the Independent, it was a whole cross-section. We met Duncan Campbell, who writes for the Guardian. He was amazing. And he helped us so much. And one day he said to me, my wife would help, you know, she'd be happy to. My wife, Julie, I said, oh, Mrs. Christie. He says, no, he says, Julie Christie. It was like a really famous actress who won Oscar after Oscar. And I just thought, I can't believe that fate has really helped us so much. And then Gary, after losing the Lord, he was so devastated. And London Tonight wanted him to do an interview. And he was so in such a bad way, I thought, he can't. But something told me, get him to do this. People will see his innocence, his naivety, his obviously intelligence as well, and they will feel, well, he can't go. Because I thought, even amongst the prosecutors, there has to be good people. There always does. Well, we did get an unexpected result, and it wasn't what we expected. It was, Gary was on there, and so many people, professionals and ordinary people, wrote in and says, he's got Asperger's syndrome. Well, we had never heard of Asperger's syndrome, and when they said it was a form of autism, we thought that meant it was basically non-verbal, and of course that's not the case. High-functioning autism, people are very intelligent, but they can't communicate, they don't know the consequences of their actions. There are so many things that childlike in ways, but I mean not like a 3-year-old, just Gary's always been young for his age. So we says no, and his solicitor said, no, get him tested. I said, no, there's no need, Gary's intelligent, there's no need. So we had him tested by Dr. Burney and by Professor Baron Cohen, and he had Asperger's. And suddenly everything fell into place because we realised why Gary was as he was. And I felt so guilty because I used to say, how can you not get it? You're intelligent. I thought he was having me on so often. And I felt so guilty because I realised he genuinely had to have everything spelled out literally. It had to be literal. And he'd also say the wrong things because he would say, well, if people ask, they should want to know the truth. I would. If someone says, am I fat? I say, yeah. Or am I this? Yeah. Because to him, they really want to know. And leaving the notes in the Pentagon, he thought, well, they want to know this because then they can sort out their security. But they didn't want people to know that Gary had walked in to something that was supposed to be incredibly secure. Well, even with the Asperger's diagnosis, it didn't stop. They were still determined to extradite him. Then I had to go back and I had to get lots of evidence. My great-grandmother spent her life, 50 years, in a mental institution and died there. And I did not want my son to die in a prison in America. I thought the same thing's not going to happen to him as happened to his grandmother. So there was mental illness in the family. More than that I won't go into all. But there were so many other things that were strong evidence. But my fear was that maybe they're not getting the evidence. How can I make sure that the politicians that really make the decision, they're really going to see it? And we went to court when Gary's barrister, QC, was away, and the prosecutor for the Home Office stood up and said, we have one substantial medical report from Mr McKinnon. Luckily, I had just given the judge the medical reports, multiple old ones, multiple brand new ones, because I thought, I had a feeling, get the new ones now, while we had a few days to think about it. And that way, the judge says, have you seen this? And he says, oh, another one of Mrs. Sharp's notes. And he says, no. He says, have you seen it? I suggest you sit down and read it. And he made the QC sit down and read it, and he wasn't happy about doing this at all. After that, I still felt we were fighting, And I emailed again, every avenue I could. And as I say, I had so many good people. I'm sure a lot of politicians were doing things behind the scenes. In fact, Gordon Brown also, he went to Hillary Clinton. He went to the American ambassador first of all, and he went to Hillary Clinton to fight for Gary. And Gary's MP, David Burrows, he went to the American ambassador and says, why are you still pursuing Mr. McKinnon after 10 years? He said, because he mocked us. I thought, well, this is just the reason, you know? But anyway, I'm coming to the end now. But the thing is, the importance of human rights. Theresa May came out, I emailed all the night before, and she made her decision, I found out, at 5:15 that morning. She phoned her advisor, said, I'm not extraditing him. And her advisor, Fiona Cunningham, jumped out of bed and screamed. And so the fact that she did it then, I feel that I was meant to keep sending evidence, because my fear was, if she'd been shown a little bit of it, a little snatch of it, saying this is it, and I wanted to know she had the whole caboodle, which she did. But she ruled, and it was under Section 3 of the Human Rights Act, and without the Human Rights Act, she couldn't have done it. So we have to really fight to keep the Human Rights Act. Yes. Basically she had to fight to keep the Human Rights Act, and also judicial review. Without judicial review, Gary would have gone. Another thing we have to fight for. Now, I don't know if any of you are on social media, but if you are, on Twitter, people RT things, petitions, they'll RT them. Don't just RT them, sign them. You have to sign them, because the days of suffragettes, they went out there, they fought with the police, they threw things at the palace, they threw themselves in front of the horses. And I'm not suggesting you do that, but just take the trouble. We're in our armchairs, but we can sign a piece of paper. How little is that? To make a difference, because in Gary's case, it was the politicians, the media, the ordinary people, the people online, people with Tourette's, celebrities, David Gilmour from Pink Floyd, Sting and Trudy, and Julie Christie, and her husband, Duncan Campbell. So it's the rich, the poor, it goes across the board. There is no difference. We are human beings, and we have to fight to keep us human. Thank you.